So, as well as ladies and gents, colleagues, good morning. My name is Tom McDermott, for those who don't know me, and I am the Director of Activities for Deaf Australia. I'm also a proud member of the Army's Posting Association. If you don't know what that is, try and find out over this next couple of days. I have the great pleasure to introduce both our keynote speaker and our principal panel for Deaf Oz Forum 2017. Our keynote speaker is Mr. Alastair MacGibbon. He is the head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and he is the Cybersecurity Special Advisor to the Prime Minister. Mr. MacGibbon joined the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet in 2016 as Australia's first Special Advisor on cybersecurity. He's now responsible for the delivery of the government's cybersecurity strategy. He's a 15-year and distinguished veteran of the Australian Federal Police, and Mr. MacGibbon was the founding director of the Australian High-Tech Crime Centre. He was also the director of the Centre for Internet Safety at the University of Canberra. We're delighted that Mr. MacGibbon's given his time this morning to come and speak to this audience, and he's going to talk to us about cyber and potential implications for cyber in conflict. Our second speaker on the panel is Professor Genevieve Bell, who is the director of the 3A Institute at the Australian National University. She's also a distinguished professor at ANU's College of Engineering and Computer Science. Professor Bell joined ANU in February 2017 after 18 years in the delights of Silicon Valley, developing Intel's social science, design research and strategy capabilities. In her role at the 3A Institute, which stands for the Autonomy, Agency and Assurance Institute, she's charged with working with CSIRO to develop a new applied science studying artificial intelligence and its impact on humanity. Professor Bell is also a senior fellow at Intel Corporation and is the inaugural holder of the Florence Violet Mackenzie Chair, named in honour of Australia's first electrical engineer. She's a cultural anthropologist by background, and she received her PhD at Stanford in 1998. The final speaker on the panel is Kirsten Oberpreuler, if I hopefully pronounced that correctly. Kirsten is the lead gamification designer for the gamification firm PentaQuest. She works as a design thinking consultant for ThinkPlace and is studying her PhD in gamification. Kirsten's passion is in the use of gamification to help people achieve their goals. She seeks to push the boundaries of what is possible with gamification, building solutions that are intuitive, highly effective, and engaging. She's currently developing games for educational institutions, the government, and private businesses, and her gamification experiences include card games, board games, digital games, and team and workplace-based gamification experiences. She recently presented in Hong Kong about the future of gamification in education, and recently spoke at the TEDx Canberra events, which I know a number of people here have attended. She's going to speak to us on how gamification might help us adapt in adversity. So we have three speakers. Mr. MacGibbon will speak for about 30 minutes, the other two for 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end with a panel discussion, at which stage I'll bring some chairs up to the front. So at this stage, I'd like you to help me welcome Mr. Alastair MacGibbon, the Cybersecurity Advisor to the Prime Minister.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honour to be here, and what a great innovation. Congratulations to you guys for putting this on. Now, this is completely unscripted, which might scare people. It scares anyone that works with me, so you're entitled to be scared as well. I'm not scared by it. Genevieve will give a really compelling speech, and you'll forget mine, so that's okay. So this is about innovation, right? It's about innovation, and we're going to talk about cyber, and then we'll kind of dwell a little bit on cyber warfare, noting, of course, that I am no military person. He's no military person would stand up unscripted and talk about these types of things. But I'm hoping I can possibly ignite some thinking in you as to where you can play a role in what is going to be the greatest existential threat, not just to the military, in my view, but to the entire Australian society that we all serve. Your families, your colleagues. It is going to be the greatest existential threat we face. There's my prediction to you, and I'd say we'll come to realise that at some stage in the near future. So, just a bit of background, a very kind introduction. I am now the head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and that is made up of the Australian Signals Directorate, ASIO, Defence Intelligence Organisation, Federal Police, Criminal Intelligence Commission, and the Computer Emergency Response Team from Attorney General's Department. About 4 or 5 months ago, the Prime Minister announced that he accepted the outcomes of the independent review into the Australian intelligence community. That affected cyber. It said that ASD would play a greater role in cyber. It would become the central capability inside the Commonwealth Government, and that we would move other elements of the Commonwealth into ASD, and that the ACSC would be part of ASD. Thus, I'm part of ASD as well. On that same day, he also announced the formation of a Home Affairs Department. I'm also part of the new Department of Home Affairs that will appear magically sometime in coming days and weeks. And in that, I own cyber policy for the Commonwealth. And therefore, the sort of strategy, thinking, what type of legislative changes do we need? How do we want to shape this for the future as a whole of government capacity? And I maintain this national role then, a roving role, similar to the counter-terrorism coordinator, working across Commonwealth, the states and territories, and with the broader community talking about cyber. And that role stays. It'll change from the current title to one that sounds a bit less interesting, but they're the three layers of the work that I'm doing. And I can say to you, as someone that's been in this space for quite some time, the stars aligned in 2017 for us to finally make some very significant changes when it comes to cyber. Just a brief hands up, anyone that works in cyber type matters? Okay, good. If you've been in there, you don't look old enough to say that you've been trying this for long enough, but I can tell you that for those of you trying to change things, it's difficult. It's difficult because you're dealing with conservative organisations. You work in conservative organisations, right? And they're designed, in fact, they have reduced risk by not changing. By being predictable, by having policies and procedures, by doing things in a routine way, in a repeatable way, you reduce risk. When it comes to cyber, by doing things in a routine, repeatable way and not changing quickly, you accrete risk. I'm going to talk about the Census shortly, because you may have noticed that stopped functioning last year, and what that did to us as a government, as small as it was. If you've been in this space a long time, we've had aspirations to dramatically improve the work we're doing and the impact of the work we're doing. And the stars weren't aligned. The politicians didn't understand. Industry wanted to cooperate, but not really to the extent that meant it was true cooperation. And the public didn't realise the type of threat environment they were in. So when I started in this space in about 2002-ish, from the Federal Police point of view, starting to set up the Australian High-Tech Crime Centre, and you're at barbecues and you said you were dealing with cybercrime, people didn't know victims. They hadn't been scammed. They hadn't had a Nigerian offer them great wealth. They hadn't met someone online who loved them so desperately that they needed to send money for the business class airfare and the sudden heart operation just on their way to the airport and other such things. They'd never had their identity compromised. They hadn't had malware on their computers. They hadn't received the call from Microsoft to say that their computer was behaving badly. Can I just install this remote access technology and I'll just move the mouse for you and load some malware up, and by the way, can I have your credit card details during the process? And now people get it. So the public gets it. And by the way, as a former police officer, I'd say to you, the public expects the police to be there to protect them offline when something goes wrong. But we've grown up with this concept that no one's there to help you in the online space. Industry realises now this is their greatest existential threat. In risk audit and risk committees and in board meetings of any large company these days, cyber security will be anywhere between number 1 and maybe down to number 4 on their risk register. And it will be a topic of conversation of every board meeting. That just wasn't the case even 2 years ago. So it's changed. And politicians, why has that happened? Well, I mentioned the Census. So I started in this new role in about, I think it was May 2016. Seems, what's that, May last year? Making it sound like it was a long time ago. August, while I was lying sick on my lounge with some bizarre sort of pneumonia type fever thing, I tried to vote, or tried to put my Census details online, and I couldn't get on. I thought, that's odd. So I disappeared into my sort of fevered haze again and didn't think anything of it until I got a phone call from the Prime Minister's office saying, the Census website's down, what are you doing about it? And I said, I don't know, I'm pretty sick. And then we realised what had happened. And by the way, I carried out the inquiry into what had occurred. The world's smallest denial of service attacks ever impeded a number of times through the day and into the evening the functioning of the website. So what? It doesn't really matter. Trouble is, in the fog of war, and as the telemetry was coming out with the functioning of the website, there was a chance, they thought, the Bureau thought, that data was leaving or that data was being manipulated. Now, there's only one thing worse than having the website knocked down by the world's smallest denial of service attacks. It was if the data itself was being exfiltrated or manipulated. So the very brave statistician, David Kalish, made the decision to turn off that website. Wow, that's a big call, let me tell you. As you may have noticed the media that followed after that, whose head was going to be on a spike, who was going to lose their jobs, how dare us not do this right. Now, why does that matter? Because the data, by the way, wasn't exfiltrated and it wasn't manipulated, and it ended up being a sense where people actually, when we got the site back up, people actually went back on it and still put their details on. Quite amazing, really. What did it teach us? It taught us that the resilience of our systems mattered. And for the first time ever, even though this was a tiny event in the scheme of things, that the public finally understood, because people in their lounge rooms started understanding this cyber thing. More importantly, the politicians started understanding it. And how did we allow our systems to be so vulnerable to these highly predictable, tiny attacks? And what were we going to do to fix it? Well, okay, that's a good question. And then we come to November and December last year, when it started coming out publicly that a foreign government was actively using the internet and connected technologies to try to influence the outcomes of the US election. It's now widely agreed in the US that Russia actively sought to impact the outcome of that election through cyber means. The only thing in question is whether or not it did impact the outcome of that election. I'll leave that for history to decide. But we saw an active campaign, and we've seen them do it in other geographies as well. Now, you can imagine what that does into the head of politicians as well. We have a pretty fragile thing, this democracy, and it's a pretty beautiful thing. And we're all here, if you think about it, if you strip back what we do, you in the military, me in the public service, we're here to protect democracy, because we ultimately answer to politicians who reflect the views, in a sort of abstract way, of the population. In the flawed way that democracy is, that is what we answer to. Ultimately, Parliament tells us. And if you're going to the concept of actually being able to tinker with the outcome of democratic elections, that's significant. So that raised and tipped up the pressure on us to innovate and change. And the last one was the WannaCry global ransomware incident around May-ish this year, where we woke up on a Saturday morning to see 40% or so of the Scottish hospital system knocked offline, or all medical systems in Scotland knocked offline. Other parts of the NHS in the broader UK, trains, large logistics companies, telephone companies and the like impacted. And why did that matter? Again, it was one of the world's worst ransomware campaigns. It's one of the fastest growing crime types, by the way. Why it mattered was because it was a pandemic style of spread and it got into critical infrastructure. And we realised that we had no real way of communicating with millions of businesses, tens of millions of Australians, on how to protect themselves. And the PM asked me two questions on that morning, two questions I couldn't answer. How impacted will we be as a government? And how impacted will our economy be? Well, I can't tell you the answer to either. Right? So that's interesting. So why don't you know? Okay, these are complex systems. They're run by hundreds of agencies and departments, all of whom own their own risk, remember? That's the 20-year philosophy we've had of devolving risk. And how do we protect ourselves in government? We adhere to the plan. We have this framework, this architecture that tells us how we're meant to get our computer systems in line, and if they're wired that way, they're okay. No, not really, that's hygiene. That's like saying I've got to wash my hands before I eat and cover my mouth when I cough. It doesn't stop me getting Ebola, but it's a good hygiene thing, and even if I'm in Africa in a high Ebola, I'll still wash my hands and cover my mouth when I cough. But it's just a good thing to do. So our hygiene, the things that have protected us for all this time, aren't really designed to protect us against the threat environment, which is rapidly evolving. So the conclusions we come to is that by adhering to the way we do our business, the traditional way of the public service de-risks things, is you have a really complex problem and you ponder it. You have a committee meeting. I'm sure it doesn't happen in the military, it's okay. But what happens in the public service is we have a meeting, let's call it in February, and we say, this is a very complex problem. Let's get everyone around the table, everyone with a potential equity in it, and we'll ponder it for a while. And we'll agree that we don't agree on it, We'll take minutes associated with not agreeing. We'll agree that 6 months later we'll come and review the minutes of what no one has done because they're all passively, aggressively, not actually wanting to own any risk associated with making a decision. Because ultimately, when society judges us somewhere down here, if my name is anywhere associated with a decision that fails, that's risky. No, it's not risky at all that we're not addressing this huge problem down here in February we identified. It's way better that when the music stops, you ain't got my name anywhere near a decision. Well, society has evolved pretty rapidly. When it comes to cyber, it evolves very rapidly, extremely rapidly. We're one of the highest adoption rates of technology in the world happens in Australia. We love technology. You know, we like to think of ourselves not as that smart a nation, but we love technology. And we use it in ways that we didn't envisage we'd use that technology. And I've spent most of my adult life dealing with people who try to show you how to misuse systems. And when it comes to technology systems, they learn really fast. They evolve, they innovate. But they only innovate, by the way, when we force them to, which we don't force them to innovate very fast because we don't change the way we do our business. So the threat is actually rapidly increasing. The environment we're operating in from a cyber point of view is worse than it ever has been. And it will continue to tick up in the badness scale. And yet we don't evolve as government agencies, we don't evolve our systems, we don't evolve the way we do our risk discussions. So what I do with my team is I empower them, literally. This might start sounding a bit heretical in a rank-based structure. Rank, to me, comes with certain responsibilities. I might be able to sign off on a bigger check. I wear the risk associated with the actions of my staff, absolutely. I believe that that rolls up. But I empower them to make decisions. They write directly to the Prime Minister because they're the expert on it, not me. I often don't see what they write. That can be a bit scary sometimes if he wants to talk about what they've written. That's where unscripting doesn't help you. Just as a tip, if you have to do it. You see, he asks questions. But I have to empower my staff to do it. And I have to say to them, I have some rules. I have some rules. The first rule is whatever you're doing has to accrete value to the Australian public, right? As a public servant, that's what we're here for. We're not here for our own jobs. We're not here for the fantastic terms and conditions and all those other things. We're here because we have to accrete value for the public. If the Commonwealth could spend its money better somewhere else, that's what it should do. But I want to give them a better ROI. That's the first thing, and the same should apply to the military. Okay, so I have to accrete value to the public. The next question I ask them to put to themselves is it legal? So that's a pretty key one. Former police officer in me says that's very important. So is it legal? Not does our policy say we can or can't do it, okay? It's is it legal? The next question I ask is it moral? Because it could be legal, but not moral. So, you know, our purchasing arrangements tells us we could do this. Like, yeah, so what's the front page test to this? How will it look to the public, who is very jaundiced towards all of us, by the way? They like the military more, but they don't, you know, generally speaking, it's a more, and Genevieve could probably tell us as an anthropologist, I think the trust in government has gone down pretty significantly, largely driven, by the way, by connected technologies and people self-selecting to groups that spread fake news. But nonetheless, a challenging thing, and we serve them, even if they don't like us. So is it accreting value to the public? Is it legal? Is it moral or ethical? And you know, what's the risk? Now, that question I actually usually ask is anyone going to die? Okay? So you know this, you make decisions of life and death in the military. I made decisions of life and death in the police. A lot of people don't get to make those decisions and they're lucky they don't have to make them. But I asked the question as I sat in corporates. I left the government in 2004 and spent time in multinationals and stunningly unsuccessfully running my own consultancy, which is why I'm back in government, but that's a different story altogether. Don't ask me about it. Genevieve can tell you about that. But she's now working at a university, so I'm not sure actually when I think about that. It's an aspirational goal, Genevieve. So is anyone going to die? And people look at me and go, what do you mean? It's like, well, okay, what's the worst that's going to happen? Am I going to be embarrassed on the front page of a newspaper that we made a decision that we thought was best value for the public in terms of accreting value for them as a society? It was legal, it was moral, and no one died from it. Yes, Senator, I made that decision. Absolutely I did. And guess what? I'll make lots of other decisions to try to protect the Australian public. I want to protect you, I want to protect your families, I want to protect the systems, this fragile democracy of ours. They're the 4 questions I get my people to ask, and I empower them to go and do business. Have they made some pretty horrendous mistakes that I've warned? Absolutely. You may have seen some press associated with a young ASD officer recently who spoke at a conference and talked about some platforms. That was his fatal error, near fatal error. And it's some hacking that had gone on. The day before, a minister had stood up and talked in very obtuse terms about this same event, and this young, very bright young guy stood up at a conference and ad-libbed a little bit and spoke a little bit more about this compromise. And front page news, shock, horror. Boy, who would have thought people could hack into small defence subcontractors who are doing things in really expensive joint fighter, strike fighter projects and other such things? Who would have thought it could happen with 4,000 to 5,000 small businesses, none of whom know anything about cybersecurity? I'm shocked that a foreign government could do that. I'm just really shocked. Anyway, I wore the risk associated with that. I didn't know he was speaking at the event. I didn't clear his notes. Actually, his notes were cleared by other people. They didn't mention anything about mentioning joint strike fighters or other such things. But no one died. Guess what it did? It actually drove a discussion. No one picked up the minister's points because they were so beige, because we gave them to him, okay? and I say that respectfully. Look at government talking points. Look at what we say. Why does the press leave our comments on the cutting room floor and get someone who's catastrophising something every time? Because they're colourful. We can be colourful, we can tell the truth, we can still protect national security while we're doing it and still try to communicate with the public. That's what you have to do. We have to innovate and change how we do these things. That young guy helped. I wore a little bit of political pressure and backlash. What are you going to do with him? I don't know. Say good speech? Don't mention platforms again? Maybe? You know, no one died. You know, the breach was already done. That's why it was there. Okay, we didn't make it any worse, and he helped by innovating. And he didn't lose his job, and he wasn't chastised. I was. Great, that's my job. It rolls up, and that's what we should be doing. As leaders, your job and your leaders is to wear the risk associated with people you trust's actions. You empower them to do their business. If you're an infantry commander, your troops act under your command. You've got to give them some discretion to do it, right? You're not going to aim the rifle every single time, and sometimes they're going to shoot the wrong spot. You own it. Same in cyber. So let's talk a little about, I don't even know what the time is. There you go, good. Let's talk about cyber warfare. I'm no cyber expert. Okay, one, let's talk about cyber warfare against us. Could it happen? I suspect so, yep. But the time someone actually does real warfare against us, in terms of cyber terms, I suspect they're also going to be shooting at us, dropping laser-guided munitions and having bombers and other things going over the top. Would a country actively do a really large campaign against us without some kinetic stuff as well? It's less likely. You might ask about North Korea. Yeah, okay, there are little asterisks next to them, a little bit less predictable. Well, actually, they're quite predictable in the sense that they don't behave like other places. Yeah, they might. We know, you know, you'll see public reporting about them having things attributed to them that most other nation states wouldn't put their name to. And you might see more of that coming out in the media in coming days and weeks. But that's not going to be a full-scale war, right? That's just going to be them doing something. We've seen them do it against the US banking system and other such things where they've gone out and hit critical infrastructure, and it's been pretty obvious that it's them. They've done the same thing against South Korea. We see them do it in a few other countries as well. You getting a lot of feedback? Am I being too noisy? Do you want me to lower my thing? Is that better? Not really. Okay, so yeah, with North Korea aside, I reckon most other countries are pretty predictable. They know the consequences of these things. So, you know, any of the other normal names you would ask questions about, I'd say, yeah, they're developing capacities. In April last year, the PM said we had an offensive cyber capability. First time Australia had ever disclosed that we had an offensive cyber capacity. And we said that it was useful for potentially military things. And then later, that same year, the PM came out and said, well, we're actively using it against terrorist groups offshore. No one complained, by the way. No one likes a terrorist, okay? And then this year, the government came out and said, we'll use offensive cyber against criminal groups operating offshore that are harming Australians. Not a whimper from the community. They kind of expected us to do it. As a Western country, it's our obligation to kind of say what our capabilities are without revealing the capabilities. So I'm sure that when a warship sails into harbour, we don't invite people in to look at how the radar system works and what the propulsion system is and other such things, but you kind of see a ship. That's the whole idea. But but we don't give the intimate details of it. Same with saying, by the way, that we have offensive cyber capabilities. Good, we should as a democracy tell our people that we have that capability. And they should be comforted knowing that we've got it. They should be comforted to know, as you know, the number of laws and lawyers and other people around it, the use, means that there are more lawyers in the room than there are technicians, more ministers and others signing off on things to do it, just as we should like any other military action. So it's a good thing. It's a governed thing. So let's talk about cyber as a weapon. So who here has heard of Stuxnet that was used? Right, okay. Was Stuxnet a clean weapon or a dirty weapon? Was it equivalent to a laser-guided munition?
It's more like a biological attack.
Okay, so yeah, and I saw some people saying it is like a clean munition. I'm going to say it's not a clean munition, this cyber thing. Because when you actually launch it, once people have been affected by it, they can capture it, look at it, see how it works, program a few more bits to it and throw it back, which is actually what happened with Stuxnet. So who knows which nation states crafted it against the Iranian nuclear facilities. And it was really good, by the way. Does anyone know how it worked? I mean, so think Homer Simpson sitting in his control room, looking after his nuclear weapon, but he's an Iranian one. And he's sitting there watching the dials, and they're all green and all good, all in the right zone for where these centrifuges were spinning. The trouble is, on the actual floor of the place where they were doing whatever centrifuges do, and apparently they're really important, they keep at a certain pace. Whoever this nation state was had targeted a particular brand of controller, which is where this little piece of malware got to via dropping USB sticks. By the way, here's the trick. When you drop USB sticks in a parking lot, with probably say things like Homer's bonus for 2012 or whenever it was, if you find it in the morning, you take it into the nuclear complex, and if you find it in the afternoon, you take it home. There's the loss, right? Because eventually, the reason why this thing got discovered wasn't because the Iranians said our centrifuges got blown up. What happened was they went home and plugged it into their home computers to see what the bonuses were going to be in the nuclear complex, not knowing they paid bonuses. So this is this concept of then this thing gets leaked out to a broader community. It would have been great if it just went into the complex and stayed in the complex. So while Homer's sitting there eating donuts, falling asleep, these things are all green, and meanwhile the centrifuges are literally getting a kinetic effect committed against them to the point where they destroyed themselves, which is great, better than bombing the place. Trouble is when you bomb a place and you drop a laser-guided munition on it, it tends to expend itself, it's extinguished, and you can't pick it up and throw it back. So when we think about cyber, and when you think about cyber warfare, and you should, and I hope you do, and you innovate and you look at the ways in this very connected society how useful it would be, you've got to think of a few things. The weapon itself doesn't extinguish. You might have seen some press about an organisation called Shadow Brokers recently that released, allegedly, some of the attack tools from the NSA. God forbid that might happen. And that those tools, one of those tools was the one that was recrafted and used in the WannaCry global ransomware campaign that I referred to in May this year. Literally days after it was released by Shadow Brokers, it got recrafted and the exploit was used against our own systems. If allegedly it was an NSA tool, interesting. So, not clean weapons. And then we've got to think about collateral damage. You spend a lot of time making sure you protect civilians, even if they're the civilians of an enemy that we're fighting. No soldier, sailor or airman wants to kill a civilian. No police officer wants to either. You spend your time making sure that you actually increase risk to yourself in order to protect the public, even if that public doesn't like you. When it comes to cyber and you're knocking out a nuclear reactor, but your weapon gets leaked out into other parts of the world, you might be affecting hospitals, air traffic control systems, traffic lights. Imagine if both went green at an intersection and people started dying. Now, we might sit there and say, well, it's just collateral damage, but it's really unpredictable collateral damage. So when we think about cyber warfare, we have to think very carefully, how do we degrade systems along the way? Are we doing those, by the way, in allied countries? What happens if the terrorist information is sitting on a server in Holland? Are we okay to go and actually take an effect against a Dutch computer? The Dutch didn't do anything against it. It just happens to be in this ephemeral way that data moves around the world, that terrorist information might be residing there. And what other data is on that system that we're destroying? So we need to think really carefully about the cleanliness of these things. I'm not saying not to do it, not at all. I like the thought of the capacity. And we need to innovate on it, and we need to think about how that could be used against us. But we need to remember that it's not, strangely, as clean as putting a tank in somewhere or a laser-guided munition from a plane or from whatever type of platform is launching it. So that's an important thing to think about. So let's talk just briefly about innovation in the dying seconds that I have. You know, who could have predicted 10 years ago? Oh, sorry, let's go back. 2003, I remember sitting in meetings with my very smart staff talking about this concept of convergence. And I felt pretty stupid. I was in several meetings with people from, back then it was DSD, and we're chatting away, and I walked out and I said, convergence. They go, this is this notional concept where your PC and your phone will merge. I'd seen Palm Pilots before, but I mean, who was using them apart from Genevieve in the Valley? I'd just been posted to America beforehand, so I'd seen some of this stuff, but it wasn't ubiquitous. It wasn't in real consumer land. And in a handful of years, like literally a handful, we'd gone to Blackberries and then iPhones and then BYO devices, inside systems. We'd converted and shifted everything. The change that we will see with the Internet of Things, which we haven't even touched on, the concept of everything reporting data, you know, when we've got to worry about the confidentiality of it, the integrity of it, which I think is the big killer for us coming up in the Internet of Things world, and the availability. Wow, what a world it will be. So unless you innovate, unless you change the way you think, unless we allow somehow people to lift up, bottom-up ideas, not top-down, because you're pretty conservative when you get to certain levels, or it's a rare day to find someone who isn't. How do we create a culture that allows, within these frameworks of predictability and discipline and order, thoughts to bubble up to challenge our conventional way of thinking? Not destroy the conventional way of thinking, but to challenge it. And I keep using this phrase every day about disrupting ourselves, because I'll tell you, government is disrupted. Everything about the Australian government today is disrupted. When I was at eBay, after I left the police, I used to live next door to a guy who was head of ad sales at Fairfax. And we'd walk to work together, strangely, and I'd keep going to eBay and he'd go to Fairfax. So they ran all the newspapers, right? Age, Sydney Morning Herald, Fin Review, and he'd say to me, you guys are idiots working on this internet thing. You're never going to win. I said, oh, why? And he said, well, we got deep pockets. You know, rivers of gold. The classified advertising space in the back of newspapers were rivers of gold. And he said, we're just going to slaughter you people. I said, we're doing for cents what you do for dollars. And we get more eyeballs and more clicks. I reckon it's you that's going to die. So what did Fairfax do as it was being disrupted? And ask yourself the question, do you see this happening in government? Fairfax first says, let's control costs. That's what you do, right? So let's control costs. Well, have less staff, that's a good one. They're pretty expensive. So let's have a few less journalists and a few, you can get some more efficiencies at the back end. Newspaper, the paper itself and printing process is expensive. Can we squeeze efficiencies? This is good stuff. Let's squeeze some efficiencies into the printing process. How do we distribute it? How do we make lighter paper because it's cheaper than to fly it places? Great, okay. And then we keep saying, well, how do we keep cutting because our revenue goes down? And so what do? Sack some more journalists. So why do you want to buy a paper where there's no journalists in it? There's no classified advertising to read, and you get into this debt spiral. Sound familiar with government? Diminishing revenues because the tax base is eroded. We stop hiring staff. You know, we haven't sat down and said, what's our strength as government? Well, one of them, by the way, in the military is we have the exclusive use of force. We're the only ones who can legislate. A whole range of things that we have as our strengths. And how do we use those strengths to serve that same public in a world that has disrupted us? Your job as innovators inside a very conservative military machine is to work out how to save us in a world that doesn't trust us anymore, in a world that is disrupted around us, in a world that is moving so much faster than our traditional organisations, as beautiful as they are designed to understand or withstand. And that's what you need to be doing, while still being good soldiers, airmen, sailors and others inside a disciplined structure. It's a tough place to be, but it's also pretty amazing. Now, so, can I just say to you, good luck with that process. Because, you know, we're going to make horrible mistakes, but but I'll say what I now say very publicly about the public service more broadly. Our traditional way of risk reduction is accreting risk for us. It is accreting it at a greater rate than we've ever seen before. And there will be catastrophic consequences for us not changing the way we do our business. No one's going to help you, by the way, and it's really unforgiving. Being a change agent in a conservative structure is really unforgiving. You'll hit roadblocks, but don't let that get in the way. Just make sure that it's, going to accrete value, that it's lawful, that it's moral, and no one's going to die as a result. Unless, by the way, it's the enemy, which is perfectly fine in a military situation. So I'll leave that to Genevieve, I suspect, and more than happy to answer questions later on. Thanks, guys.